Hello everyone. This lecture is about Piaget's theory of cognitive development. We're going to look at the four-stage theory, not paying attention to the substages of the sensory motor stage, but looking at it overall. Piaget became intrigued by children's mistakes, and initially he noticed that children of the same age often made the same kind of mental mistakes, errors that were typically different from those made by younger or older children. So he devoted his life to studying how children think, not just what they know. Piaget began his studies with a close observation of his own 3 children, and then later studied larger samples of children in what became a clinical method. The objectives for this session are to explain Piaget's theory of cognitive development, to look at the main features of children's cognitive development from birth to adolescence with a focus on childhood, and to understand the strengths and limitations of Piaget's theory of cognitive development. Towards the end of this lecture, I'll also give you a little bit of a cross-cultural perspective on Piaget. So cognitive development is concerned with the development of our ability to engage in higher mental processes, to enable us to make reasonable choices and decisions about our behaviour. So cognition includes reasoning, judging, problem solving, deciding, comparing, and all of the other mental processes that we have to deal with information. Cognitive development starts in infancy and extends throughout the lifespan. Many theorists also believe that cognitive development could possibly start pre-birth, but this particular area hasn't been researched as yet. According to your text, cognitive development involves changes that occur in the nature and complexity of children's thinking. And this is quite a good definition because it explains how the thinking changes throughout the different stages. Cognition itself is the activity of knowing. It's the activity of thought, and it's the processes through which knowledge is acquired and problems are solved. Through first examining his own children and then conducting studies of other children, Piaget concluded from his observations that children's thought processes were different from adult thought processes, both qualitatively and quantitatively. As infants and children explore their world, their brains respond by creating schemes, sometimes called schemas. These schemes are cognitive structures or organised patterns of action or thought that people construct to interpret their experience. Schemes are like having a set of rules or procedures that structure the way we think about things. For example, in infancy, the infant's grasping actions and sucking actions are very early behavioural schemes, and they build on those schemes when they learn to be purposive with the way they reach out to grasp different objects. During the second year of life, children develop symbolic schemes where the cognitive structure or thought process that's used to understand the experience becomes fanciful or symbolic, or in some ways, early children in the stage of early childhood give human qualities to inanimate objects. So that's part of the symbolism that they develop. Before we go into looking at the 4 stages of Piaget's model and the sort of thinking that happened in each specific stage, it's important to outline the assumptions behind his model. His key assumption was that a child's mind develops in a series of stages, and this is very much reflected in his theory. It was previously demonstrated or previously assumed that a child knew less, not differently, to adults. Piaget, however, suggested that each stage of cognitive development occurs within a specific age range and is characterized by the development of particular learning and thinking skills. His approach is still used in educational settings, and for many people, Piaget is to human and cognitive development a little bit like what Shakespeare was to the literacy world, or what Aristotle was to the world of philosophy. In other words, he's a key thinker, and his model of cognitive development is used not just in education, but also in some areas of paediatric nursing to encourage nurses to understand how to communicate with children, how to understand children, and how to enlist their cooperation in a variety of different ways while delivering interventions or nursing procedures. The first stage of Piaget's theory, which we've actually looked at previously, is the sensory motor stage. This was the stage from birth to 2 years where the child experiences things simply through their senses. It's also the time where the main cognitive achievement is called object permanence, when a child realizes that something that is taken away or something that has left the environment is going to come back. It hasn't just disappeared forever. Stranger anxiety, which is a stage of early attachment, is also a feature of the sensory motor stage. In this course, we aren't going to go into detail into the 6 stages within the sensory motor stage. We're just going to look at the sensory motor stage very generally. The second of Piaget's stages was called the pre-operational stage of child development. And along with this stage, along with the following stage, is when a lot of development takes place. So between the ages of 2 and 7 years, a child develops language. They also start to become more aware of themselves as contrasted with other people, and start to develop a sense of self-concept and self-identity. Children between 2 and 7 can represent objects by words and other symbols, and symbolic play or pretend play is important. Once a child starts to pretend, that's another important feature of cognitive development. One of the things that a child cannot do in this particular stage is they cannot conserve mass, liquids and shapes. and I'll go on to explain what this is in the following slide. They also cannot subtract or add mathematically. They can't reverse operations, and I'll also go on to explain that in the next slide. One of the features of the pre-operational stage of child development, though, is that children are very egocentric. The world revolves around them, and this is a particularly normative aspect of the pre-operational stage. Usually, egocentrism resolves with maturity as children develop and grow older, but sometimes this persists into adulthood, often as a result of the sort of conditioning that the person has had. One of the important things that happens in the pre-operational stage, though, is something that I've referred to before, which is assimilation and accommodation. Assimilation being the incorporation of new information into mental frameworks that already exists. So, for example, a child believing that all big animals are horses or all cars are trucks, and making errors when they're naming things and being exposed to new experiences. And the second process is accommodation, which is when the child modifies the existing schema as a result of exposure to new information. So when a child can differentiate between a horse and a camel, they have then accommodated that knowledge. But the processes of assimilation and accommodation start in the sensory motor stage and then continue right through to the formal operational stage. The third stage of Piaget's cognitive theory is called the concrete operational stage, and this occurs after the pre-operational stage at the age of approximately 7. This is when a child can conserve. So the use of the word conserve and conservation in terms of Piaget's theory doesn't mean the same thing as the environment. It's a completely different concept. So a child can conserve mass, numbers, and volume. They can also reverse mathematical operations. So a child between the age of 7 and 10 years, if they're given a problem such as 8 plus 4 equals 12, they can reason out that 12 minus 4 equals 8. And this is something that primary teachers work with when the child hits about year 2 and 3 in the primary school curriculum. So it's at the very end of the infancy years, heading into the primary school years. A child at the concrete operational stage still experiences problems with reasoning and cannot understand abstract concepts and hypothetical situations. They're very black and white between the ages of 7 and 10. They're very literal, very concrete, and what I mean by black and white, meaning that there's usually only two alternatives to their thinking. So morally as well, they would see things as either right or wrong. So a person who doesn't look the same as their parents, for example, they may automatically label as bad because they've only had their parents to deal with or their guardians to deal with, and they haven't been exposed to a lot of difference often at this age. Sometimes they have, but this is just something that happens with their cognitive reasoning. We'll just go on now to give a little bit more light to what the concept of conservation actually means. This is something that children can do after the age of 7. So this is an example of what happens when a child can conserve liquid. If they're given 2 tumblers with identical levels of water in it, they will say that there's the same amount of water in each one. If 1 tumbler of water is then put into a long glass, then a child who is less than the age of 7 years will look at the tall glass and believe that it has more water in it than the smaller glass, even if they've seen it poured. And that's because at the pre-operational stage, before the age of 7, they cannot conserve. That's what this skill is actually called: conservation of liquid and mass, and the process is called conserving. This slide is reflected on page 284 of the Hoffnung text, and this gives you all of the other ways that children can conserve between the ages of 7 and 10. So children can conserve liquid, which is the example that we've just had. They can also conserve mass. So if the tester or the adult or somebody takes 2 equal amounts of Play-Doh and changes the shape of the item in much the same way as we change the shape of the container with the liquid, then a child who's at the pre-operational stage will always say that the object that looks longer has got more Play-Doh than the one that looks smaller, even if they've seen the Play-Doh being manipulated. Children can also conserve numbers, and there's an example of this given on the Views site under Module 4. There's also an example of how children can conserve length. So if they're given 2 identical straws, but one is manipulated so that it changes shape, then a child under the age of 7 will not identify that those straws are actually the same length. But a child between the age of 7 and 10, most of them will actually identify that they actually are the same. And this is because at the concrete operational stage, this is the feature of cognition. So just to repeat this, because this is an important difference between the pre-operational stage and the concrete operational stage, a child who is in the pre-operational stage of development cannot conserve liquid, mass, numbers or length. But a child between 7 and 10 who is in the concrete operational stage can conserve liquid, mass, number and length. So when we say they can conserve, they understand it. They don't make mistakes. You can't trick them. But if you look at some of those audio visuals on the Views site under this module, you'll see some actual examples of that where younger children can actually be tricked, but older children cannot. So of course it's not a trick, but this is often how we assess children this way, by making it some sort of a game. But what we're really doing is assessing their cognitive ability. The formal operational stage happens from the age of 11 onwards. After the age of 11, heading towards puberty and heading towards the teenage years, children start to develop abstract logic. They are capable of solving hypothetical propositions. What would you do if? They can take a leap of imagination and imagine things that they can't imagine prior to the age of 11. they can deduce and understand consequences much better in the formal operational stage. One of the things about Piaget's theory is that he didn't have a stage after the formal operations stage. He believed that once a child hit 11 years of age, their cognitive development was complete, at least biologically. Since Piaget developed his theory, though, now, there is some belief that there's actually another stage after the formal operational stage, but we're not going to go into that in this course. We're just going to look at the four stages as Piaget envisaged them initially. In terms of the nature-nurture debate, Piaget acknowledged that children build schemes from their experiences, which is the nurture side of the debate, using their inborn intellectual functions, which is the nature side of the debate. So intelligence then, according to Piaget, does develop through interaction with the environment, but it's actually nature that provides the complementary processes of assimilation and accommodation. So in terms of the nature-nurture debate, Piaget was very much a believer in biological maturation. He believed that it was the maturity of the brain developing that caused these cognitive changes, unlike other theorists who believed it was the influence of the social world. Piaget didn't believe that the social world could impact heavily on cognitive development. He believed that it was largely through biology. One sign of a good theory, going back to earlier stages in the course, is that it is systematic, logical, and stimulates research. And Piaget's developmental perspective has been applied to many aspects of human development. His theory has undoubtedly stimulated much research on children, and he also showed us that infants and small children are very active in their own development. But for more than half a century, researchers have been studying Piaget's theory and implementing cross-cultural applications. So numerous cross-cultural studies and comparisons have been done in many countries around the world, such as Africa, Australia, India, Indonesia, New Zealand, and Switzerland, also China. And the results of these studies have shown that the sensory motor, pre-operational and concrete operational stages are consistently found in many cultures throughout the world, providing support that these stages may indeed be universal and may indeed be driven largely by maturational forces. However, there is considerable cross-cultural variation in the age at which each stage is achieved and in the rate of progression through the stages. Studies have also found that progressing to the formal operational stage is more variable amongst different cultural groups, more variable than the early stages, and sometimes does not always seem to occur. And this was something that Piaget himself reflected upon. So what would explain why some individuals in some cultures or socio-cultural groups progress more slowly through the early stages and never reach the formal operational stage? It actually comes down to variations in experiences across cultural groups. Advanced educational experiences, for example, seem to be essential but not alone sufficient to achieve formal operational thought. So, in some cultures where there isn't such a thing as higher education and a philosophy where the mind is used for abstract thought or hypothetical thought, this actually may explain why in some of the cross-cultural studies they've done, that the individuals that they have examined haven't displayed that formal operational thinking, because culturally it actually doesn't occur in the particular culture which was studied. So, just to summarise what I'm saying here, while cultural and experience factors influence the rate of cognitive growth, the direction of development is almost always universal. So, in other words, children of all cultures pass through the sensory motor stage, the pre-operational stage, and the concrete operational stage, but the rate at which they move through those stages seems to show some diversity according to which cultural group. Piaget seems to have in some ways underestimated the cognitive abilities of infants and young children, but he did emphasize that he was more interested in understanding the sequence of development rather than the specific ages at which they occur. So his stages are quite broad. I mean, if you think back to the pre-operational stage, there's an incredible difference between the thinking of a 2-year-old child and the thinking of a 6-year-old child, but all of those aspects of the pre-operational stage occur between the ages of 2 and 7. I had a young student in my class once, a very, very young student, who was indeed 7 years old. And I gave this particular lecture, and the little girl came up to me afterwards just to tell me that she actually could conserve, that when I showed that audio visual of a child of her age getting confused with the amount of liquid that was put in to a cup, that she didn't, that she understood it from the very beginning. And I said to her mother after the class that this clearly demonstrated the fact that these stages were not fixed in concrete. When we think about accelerated learning in schools, even when we think of things like developmental delay, these are the sorts of aspects that the examiner or the person who's testing the child are looking at. They're not looking at small differences, they're looking at big differences. Sometimes people who have an intellectual disability never move past the concrete operational stage. They never learn to think in an abstract way. But what we do as health practitioners is we take the knowledge of where they're at in their development and we change the way we deliver instructions, knowledge, guidance and support. So we still have to remember that it's important to treat people with age appropriate activities, but if somebody has a cognitive age of about 10 years, that doesn't mean that they're any less than anyone who has a cognitive age of formal operations. It simply means that they think differently, so any interventions with a person who is a very concrete thinker have to be targeted towards that knowledge. And that's the conclusion of this short lecture on Piaget's theory of cognitive development, and I will leave it to you to follow up with questions and clarifications and perhaps some examples and scenarios in your tutorial sessions. Thank you.